One. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Inclusion Cafe. Today with me in the cafe is James Cheng. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Joe, for having me on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I am lucky this evening to have you in the cafe for a number of reasons, but for our listeners, I'm going to preface this a little bit. This is the first time I've actually had a mentor on. For those listening, James and I have kind of had a mentee-mentor relationship over the years, and we've done some great and amazing D&I projects together.
Yes, we have. Been a fun journey so far.
Absolutely. So if you could, I know you well, James, but let's let the listeners get to know you a little more. Could you share a little bit about who you are, types of positions you've had in the past, and kind of your passion around DE&I?
Absolutely. So I'll go backwards. So currently I am the global head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Zimmer Biomet, leading our efforts around our work as well as in the talent space with a heavy focus there. And prior to this, I was global director for inclusion and diversity and talent acquisition over at Gilead Sciences. Before that, I was at Cargill and their global inclusion diversity COE as one of their leaders that led the business resource groups or ERG work, as some people might say, and business development work. And then prior to that, I was at Best Buy doing D&I work as well. But I will say this, I'm a non-traditionalist, which is I didn't start off at D&I. I did not even start off in HR. I actually came from retail end, went to operations, leadership, went to IT. So being very, very non-traditionalist. And through ERGs is how I actually got into D&I work. So a little fun side there. Of course, during that time with Best Buy, I actually served in the military and the National Guard side of the house, so part of the Air Force. So I'm also a veteran, and I'll say this out front, I am a LGBT man, veteran, person of an invisible disability, and I've had the pleasure of truly experiencing this work both personally and professionally. So little just highlight of my background.
Yeah, you and I joke, you're the ultra diverse candidate. Anytime you go into a new role or a new organization, they get it all, right?
Hey, you know what? As long as I can bring it to the table, then yes, I would say that would be a plus.
Yeah, sometimes because we've done so much together, and gosh, especially over the past few years, I sometimes forget about that veteran piece, right? When you're working with someone, and it's just always good to kind of be in that kindred spirit and have that. So thank you for your service in that. And I know we've had that conversation a lot, but today we're going to spend time talking about ERG, something that you are very familiar with. And this is not something we've talked about on the podcast before, and I thought you'd be an amazing guest to come on and talk about this. So let's dive into this.
Absolutely. ERGs is, to say the least, a passion, as I said earlier. It's my path into my dream role, as I like to say.
Yeah. So a lot of people listening to this, James, probably kind of have an understanding of the acronym ERGs or BRGs, as you referred to them as well. But let's start out and define it for the listeners, right? So kind of in your own words, define what an ERG, a BRG is, and kind of what their overall role is in the organization. Start there.
Absolutely. So I would definitely say you consider it within any organization, whether it's corporations, whether it's government or otherwise. ERGs are groups that form together with a common purpose, generally, with that is aligned around similarities, whether that is belief, experiences, background, whatever it may be. And these groups generally form together to have a community where they're at, where they may not feel or may not think that they are fully represented. Now, commonly in some organizations, you hear it around forming for gender-related groups, and as well as ethnicity and cultural difference types groups. Now, in some organizations, there's one surrounding other areas. Like if I remember Microsoft, for example, they're an organization that has actually quite a bit of selections of ERGs, where they have everything from religion to age and different things.
Yeah.
So depending on the organization, generally these are a group of people who have certain common experiences, goals, or whatever it may be. And if a ERG is more experienced in the areas of aligning to the company's mission, vision, or values, it tends to focus in that space.
Yeah. Thank you for defining that. And what do you think the value is, James, around having kind of those multiple segments of ERGs, not just the compliance segments, right? The race, ethnicity, and I guess let me dial it in a little bit more. So a lot of organizations form ERGs for women, and they
Yep.
also form ERGs for Black African American employees and allies, right?
Yep.
We'll talk about the allies in a minute. But there are companies, like you said, I think you mentioned Microsoft, that have Black women ERGs, like sub ERGs. And I mean, I just wanted to know kind of what your thoughts are around just the overall value of having expanded ERGs within the organizations.
Absolutely. One of the biggest things is the ability for groups to form to have a voice
Mm,
and create additional value where it's unseen or unknown. And that's one of the big things that people tend to not notice right away, because ERGs are literally, like I said, buried treasure that you would have may or may not ever consider. Because
yeah,
again, how often would you realize that you actually have an internal focus group, internal access to the community insights, people that have not just wanting to do the work because they're in the organization, is because people are doing it out of passion for the
yeah,
work, right?
yeah,
Because generally your best employees are the ones who cares the most for the work. And then when you have people who volunteers their time outside of their day job above and beyond because they have a cause and they have their life experience that they can bring to the table that the
yeah,
organization may or may not have considered, this is a treasure trove of talent and capability and innovation, actually, as you think about for most organizations. And having that diversity of selection of ERGs is a great example. And one of them that we kind of headed into was think about veterans.
yeah,
That ERG group, most people may or may not even have because they never considered. And we're talking about a population out there that has unique skills, ability when it comes to organization, operations, having a structure that's very, very formal to, again, very logistical to a lot of different things. And that's a talent pool that people may not even realize that could easily be found in one ERG. So
yeah.
just an example.
Yeah, no, I think it's great examples, or a great example. I so anytime I work with clients or consult on strategies, processes, especially on the talent acquisition side, ERGs is always and will be always part of that strategy and process. Because just like you mentioned, it's your company that makes up the ERGs. It's the culture that makes up the ERGs. From a hiring standpoint, it's the managers and leaders who are doing the hiring, right? So leveraging that, I think to call out that type of value um, is spot on.
And I
I
would
know. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, and when you think about the value, right?
Yeah,
When people think about what is the value of an ERG, think
yeah,
about it as access. They are literally an access to a pipeline, not just talent, but ideas, innovation, thoughts, perspective, your global market. And this is something I tend to have to point out to business leaders, especially. What better than people who lives in the community to tell you about the community and how to
yeah,
approach the community, right? Whether you're government, how to reach your constituents, whether you are talking about nonprofit, how to serve the communities you're trying to support, or if you're a business, how to reach the communities that you may or may not be in business with.
yeah.
That's where the ERGs truly come into play.
It kind of brings me to something I wanted us to talk about. It's funny you brought that up this early in the conversation because knowing the value is that high on ERGs, right? And I know you, James. Your strategy process. This has to do this to get us to that, right? Um, how should these ERGs or BRGs be structured within the organization? Like, kind of how do they set? What aspects do they need to touch? Um, yeah, let's talk about the structure a little bit of ERGs.
Absolutely. I would always say this from a structural perspective, something that aligns to the organization's mission or purpose,
Mm,
that is critical. So if the organization is striving to be the best place to a best and preferred place to work, for example, that is a thing. Organization will go after that, right? So that means you're going to have to invest in talent. So with that, that leads into the direction of how can we structure something that will give them opportunity to influence talent, whether that is a structure that will support talent acquisition help, whether that is structure that creates partnerships to drive and keep retention of talent in the organization by creating communities. Again, build it around what the company's purpose and mission is,
yeah,
and the structures will again support that, and that's the key.
yeah.
So number one thing, make sure there's an executive sponsor,
Mm,
someone that truly is up there to give them the ability to have a true voice and a seat at the table to truly contribute.
yeah,
Um, Make sure there's leaders that could be developed in the process, and growing those talent, and that will be part of opportunity for those ERGs. So that's part of the structure, right? You're going to have your sponsor. You're going to have need leaders to lead while they're there, and then again, purpose-driven focus, which could be pillars or leads that
yeah.
support the work that is directionally aligned to mission. So I would say in those three areas, it's key.
I wonder. So it sounds like you're saying a lot of it needs to be tied to values and things like that, and it touches a lot of different areas, talent acquisition, HR, and things like that. But I wonder if the structure looks different based off size of company, industry of company, and it sounds like the leadership needs to be really bought in here.
Absolutely. And I always say people, it doesn't have to be big, but it has to be purposeful, right?
I like that.
Again, if you're a very small organization, and I've actually been working with some other organizations that are much smaller. I'm talking about under 1,000 individuals, or even well under 500, for example. Even with organizations like that have small groups, again, if you always have someone who's higher up that will truly back that work, have someone that helps guide and lead, and then of course again having structure that's built amongst what you're trying to go after,
Right.
those are the ERGs that are going to be successful
Yeah.
ultimately. And it doesn't matter scale, well, you're just talking about adding more people to it, honestly.
That's a good point. That's a good point. It's just it seems like there's not necessarily a cookie cutter strategy, but there are some aspects that you absolutely want to make sure you include. Like you mentioned, that executive sponsor partnerships with across multiple lines of businesses. I believe you called them the pillars, right? So,
Correct.
um, I think I jumped ahead a little bit of what I wanted us to talk about, but I have been I've partnered with several clients in setting up ERGs from the ground up. You'll go into a client or a company, they'll have maybe one or two ERGs. Nine times out of 10, it's around race and ethnicity, right? Or veterans. Um, but the other ERGs either don't exist or they're in an infant stage and have been for years, right? So my question is, what are your thoughts on around when companies start to formulate these ERGs? We talked about the structure, but what are some of the things they need to think of? We talked about executive leadership. We've talked about some of the areas that they need to touch from a strategy side, but what are some other things they need to think of?
Number one thing I'm going to tell people, and this tends to be again a challenge for many organizations, is that one, when you do form an ERG, making sure that they don't forget their business day job when they're in the ERG.
Yeah.
Okay. It's fair and fair, and that people is going to want to do things because they're passionate about it. But that's why I said earlier, making sure it's tied to something purposeful in the
Right.
organization that brings it all back. Because otherwise, if they do not have that direction, that's where you have ERGs that don't grow, right? You
Mm,
need to have that purpose. And to be able to have that purpose tied to the organization, those members need to keep on their business hat when and or whatever their organizational hat is, right? They need
right.
to bring that into your ERG. You don't take off one hat to wear the ERG hat. It should be one and the same, because what you're driving towards should be supporting the organization that you're working with. So I would say that's the number one thing that a lot of ERGs tend to fail on, is that again, they take off one hat to do something else, assuming they're separate. They're one and the same
Yeah.
ultimately.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You talked about growth just now, like growing ERGs, and you just mentioned something that could impact the growth. What are some other things when we're thinking about companies who want to grow their ERGs or increase memberships? What are some of the things that they can be thinking about there?
I will always say it is important to include those people in the decision making and building of the team, right?
Hmm.
A lot of organizations I've seen have a tendency of just, I'm going to appoint someone to do it,
Right. Yes.
or try to specifically build it in the image that they think it should be ran, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there should be guidance, there should be structure. But if you don't have buy-in for the population who has the passion,
Yeah.
it's never going to grow the way that you need it to long term. So always include them in the process. And this is going to take some dedication. That's going to either have someone that can help form the ERGs, whether that's a
Right.
leader in DEI or someone that specializes in ERGs. But it's important to have someone that can truly build the strategy, build the structure, build the governance
Yeah.
with the constituents who wants to be ERG members,
Mm.
and in the same time, in respect to the sponsor and the company, bring those values and those ideas and those purposes into the conversation, so your people who are ERG members see that, hey, this is what the organization needs. We want to meet your needs, and having someone that can bring those two together to drive it forward.
I, I I recall setting up my first ERG. And again, great insights, James. Thank you for sharing. And it was actually some some mentorship that you gave me. If you remember back when I would contact you about some of the first ERGs that I was setting up, and I found value. And I think this is what you alluded to in your response here. Having a core team, usually anywhere from 5 to 8 people, no more than 10 for your core team. But we would assign positions on that core team. We'd have a communications person, right? We would have a chair and a co-chair, right?
Yes.
Uh, we would have a membership person that focused on chapter creation, and that's another thing to talk about. You know, if you have a multiple location organization, you need to have chapters. So we really structured it out in these ERGs, and also, you know, you use the word intentional, creating what we called AOPs, or annual operating plans, right? For a whole fiscal year. You know, this is how we're going to operate from an external or excuse me, from an internal standpoint. And we're going to build in a little bit of an external component, because I think ERGs a lot of time get so focused on the internal, they miss those external opportunities. The only time they really get exposed to the external community from an ERG perspective is like at a career expo or summit. 9 times out of 10, it's with talent acquisition. But there's other things you can do. I know ERGs that I've worked with in the past, they volunteered with Habitat with Humanity. They've done community outreach. And I think having a detailed plan of what we're going to do throughout the year, I think that's how ERG leaders and things like that need to think about, with that executive sponsorship, following up and checking in. Hey, how are we doing on our plan?
Absolutely. I would say from my past working for Best Buy, Cargill, Gilead, now Zimmer Biomet, it's a common theme that, again, we're talking about corporate on this stance, but
Right.
even when non-corporate perspectives, like I said, I use government as an example. I've actually been working with some individuals in different government agencies. Again, it's tied to your purpose. So for corporate, like in my mind, tends to focus around talent as one, community relations as one, was you just kind of mentioned, some type of business focus, and of course membership and comps. Those are common few that is tied within a corporate environment, right? When you think about government, that's a little different, right? And
Yeah.
this is where it's unique. So government has a tendency of having, again, completely different model than corporations in many ways. But I know one organization was working with me, and they were talking about, well, how about areas of focus that's tied to purpose, that is not specifically driven by your standard internal operations, but external operations. So government, they are there to serve constituents. So there's one one government organization that's trying to build their ERG, and one of the areas they're trying to work on is race equity, because that's something that's government interest.
Yeah.
It's not something that traditional corporations would tackle, but again, make it tied to your purpose, and that gives you your structure. So that's an example that's slightly different. And like I said, I use government as an example,
Yeah.
but that's one.
Well, it's another way to get your buy-in too, because you have to have that buy-in, right? It's one thing to have an executive leader that sees the importance of it and puts their name on it. But when you get buy-in from those, I always said the senior manager, associate directors, I mean, throughout the organization, you just see so much movement. And it helps out a little bit when you're trying to fund your ERG as well. So we won't get into budgets tonight, but um, we do know that can be a pain point at times for ERGs.
That's true. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's take a turn a minute and talk a little bit about ERG membership. Okay, we mentioned that when you're a company and you have multiple locations, it's good to have chapters to make sure every location has an opportunity to participate in ERGs. Global companies, ERGs look different. I have never experienced, me personally, a global ERG, right? Where it's, where it operates the same in the States as it operates the same overseas. It may be the same ERG, but those AOPs that we talked about are completely different. Now there's that piece, I want you to kind of think through and talk through. But the other piece is ERGs just aren't for the segment of diversity that they represent, right? There is a lot of ERGs have almost as many allies in them as they do members of the segment of diversity. So if you could just talk through a little bit about those two things, about the importance of allies within the ERG, kind of what their role is. And I want us to have some conversation around that, because I identify as a ally and advocate for all diversity, right? So when I come into an ERG, if it's not veterans or individuals with disability, I'm just a white guy from Northeast Georgia, right? I'm an ally for everything, everything and anything. So yeah, let's talk about that for a little bit.
So I would say one of the biggest things about having allies, and I should clarify allies in a way that should be seen. Allies are people who truly, in a way, either want or is passionate in what you may believe in. Okay, whether that's experience, whether it's culture, whatever it may be. And again, in ERGs, there's multiple types of ERGs. And those are the people who are your advocates that are going to stand by you when someone different might challenge you, right? And again, it does not have to be race related, not gender related, because again, diversity means multiple different things. It is a different. We are all built in with different intersectionalities, right?
Yeah.
But having an ally truly amplifies your voice, because there's times when you don't have a seat at the table and your allies will. And those are the ones who opens those doors, and at least, if not amplifies that voice, to have a seat at the table. So that's one thing where allies truly is vital for any group. Two, I'll say this as always, the more you have, the louder it's going to get.
I love that. That is awesome. I like that. I like that a lot.
It's the truth.
It is.
And it's funny because the more you have, the louder it gets, the more people who hears it. And at the end of the day, people want to be heard. Okay. And
Yeah.
if you give them something to speak about to be heard, then you know what? That is where you go into purpose,
Mm.
because then they're talking to something that's purposeful. And then with that louder voice, more people hear, more people spread. And that is critical when you have allies. Because allies, again, they're there as a supporting arm. And I always say they're literally your amplifier.
Yeah.
So a little
Yeah,
bit
I
of that.
love the term force multiplier, right? I've used that ever since obviously I coined it in the military, or not coined it, but I picked it up in the military. And then, it's something that's carried over. For me, being an ally of multiple ERGs, anytime I go into a client or a new company, that's one of the first things I do. Hey, I'm here. I want to be part of your ERG. It's for me has been educational, right? The exposure it gives me to the culture that the ERG represents, or the community and those connections.
Yes.
It also, and I think I just realized this right now, it helps me understand and learn about the company and its culture a lot quicker, right?
Yep.
Being a part of those calls, being a part of what they're doing, it's a growth thing, right? And it helps me eat up that learning curve, because anytime you go into a new organization, especially like me, going from the military, from healthcare to biotech to so on and so forth, right? There's learning there. And the faster you eat up that learning curve, the better. And I always encourage every veteran that transitions out of the military, go to the ERGs. Sign up for the veteran ERG and any other ERG that you're interested in, because you're going to learn the company faster than you would by not doing that. So I don't know if a lot of people think about that, but that's something that I've come to really benefit from.
It's perfect that you said that, because it's funny when I said it in the beginning of how I actually got into DEI work, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It was because I supported ERGs. I chaired a couple of them. I always participated. I was always on their list. Um,
Yeah,
and you know what? It got me access to people that I would have never crossed paths with. Because
exactly.
again, you're meeting a bunch of people across the organization that you never talk to, because they may not support, align, or even touch your specific area of business, right?
Right.
And that led to my career in the space. And that's that power of connection, that speed to connection, right? So that's one thing that I always tell people too, is again, it's not just getting yourself speed, a growth spurt quickly in the organization, but it's your access to the organization. Because you're talking about an intricate web of people that might know things that you will never even consider in an organization.
Yeah.
And usually, as I come into an organization, the first group I tend to join are the ERGs, like you just said. But I'm intentional with the questions I want to ask.
Yeah.
Because I know
What are you doing? How are you funded? What is the commitment? Oh, you don't have executive leadership? Let's fix that. It's yeah, I get it.
even as a new person who joined like my organizations, every one of the ones I've been in, when I actually joined their ERGs, I actually ask, so what do I need to learn about our company that I should know now before I make mistakes too soon, right? Or in the future? There's always people that are going to tell you, avoid this, do this.
Yeah.
Here's the person you need to connect to, and you need to know this person in this organization. Even if it's not related to your business, you need to know this person. Like,
Yeah.
that's where the ERG's power is. It's that network, that connection, that diversity and range that you have
Oh,
when
I
it comes
love
to the
that.
organization.
I love that. The range. Yeah. I think that hits it right on the head. It does. It gives you that exposure to the people that you wouldn't necessarily necessarily have access to. I know. I wouldn't at the levels that I've worked. Absolutely. I had some of my first conversations with executives at Aetna, and Mark Bertolini himself, the CEO at the time. This is way before the CVS merger. That's how I met him. Like, I was running the program at dotted line in to an executive sponsorship, but actually being able to like have that type of conversation and show the program from that area, I mean, you can't put a value on that. You really can't. And another thing that organizations, and I'll just say this before we move on to the next thing we wanted to talk about tonight, organizations that do not have some type of way to connect with their ERGs during the onboarding process are missing an opportunity. I mean,
Yes.
it, I hope it becomes an industry standard across all industries it's in your onboarding process. Either you're getting a packet before you, after you sign that final offer letter, when you're getting information about your benefits, you should be getting information about your company's ERG policies and things like that. That's a personal opinion, right? But I think it says so much about the organizations that do that and put that up front.
And let me back and support that a little bit. I'll give you two examples of exactly what you're talking about. Facebook, I'll just use that as a company.
Yeah.
During their interview process, if once you get to a certain point, they will actually give you an actual access to a database of ERG members that you can choose up to a few people to interact and find out about the company through an ERG member's view.
Wow.
And that's part of the interview process. Before you're hired, here's access, talk to a few of our members and they literally have a list of ERG members across different businesses, across all the different ERGs. And you're welcome to choose up to 3. And these are people who volunteered as an ERG member to be part of that call list, to welcome new people. And again, these are potential candidates, not even people who are hired yet. So that's an example of one. Another one I would say was at my time at Cargill, there was an ERG called GROW, Group Responsible for Welcoming New Employees.
Oh, wow.
And that is a dedicated ERG that's focused for people who are new. That's another segment of diversity that people don't think about. New people coming in, if you all had a cohort of people who just came in with, that you can lean on when you're, because I'm brand new, you're also brand new, and you're brand new.
Yeah.
You have a common theme there. And that's something I had loved when I experienced that at Cargill. So again, there's different versions of them, but the power to connect. And the funny thing is, some people never leave that group because the connection they built in there doesn't mean that you have to stop in one ERG. You can join multiple. So they kept that network so they can welcome new people in and be their lead into everything else. So it was a powerful thing that I loved.
Yeah, that's amazing. So those examples are examples of companies who get it, right? And not only do they get how to leverage their ERGs, but they just get inclusion hands down. And I think there is massive value into what they're doing, right? I just had in my mind, let's just connect them into an ERG, but to have dedicated people who can tell your company's story, I think that's phenomenal. So not to take away from the positivity of our conversation, but I mean, we got to talk about the pros and let's talk a little bit about the cons now. So what do ERGs get? What do they get wrong? Where do they kind of drop the ball? What are some, I guess a better question is, what are some pitfalls the ERGs need to avoid?
Absolutely. Number one, first and foremost, it's not about power. So power dynamics and politics need to stay out of ERGs because again, that's just like any organization. That's where it becomes toxic, first and foremost. So I will always tell people, it's about helping each other. It's not about who's going to have more power and influence, ultimately, right? That's number one pitfall for ERGs. Second biggest pitfall, no direction.
Yes.
You need to have direction for ERG members and leaders in the space. Because if there's no direction, they're going to do things just to do things. And that doesn't help anyone. So having direction, and I always say, tie it back to the business, tie it back to the whether it's your mission, your vision, your values, whatever it may be, but tie it back to that. Because again, that direction doesn't change. It'll continue moving forward, right? And then the last pitfall I always say is being left out. Do not leave the ERGs out. They should be taken along the journey because remember, these are people who are passionate enough to do things outside of their general day job, going above and beyond. These are the ones who go the extra mile intentionally. So think about including them in your process, because these are the ones who are truly dedicated to you, that will truly drive the things that if you give them the direction to do, they'll most likely shine for you.
Yeah.
In your organization. So those are my biggest pitfalls that I would definitely say people need to. Oh, and sorry, I have one more. Investing in them.
Yes.
So, and I
was going to cover that if you didn't.
No, you're right. You're right. Investing in them, not just financially, but again, participation from leadership. Because if they are not bought in, you can give them all the money in the world. It won't change anything.
Right.
Because ultimately, those two things has to happen to make sure things move forward.
Yeah.
So
you mentioned two of the three. I would say fund your ERG, fund them, and don't tell your ERGs we'll just have fundraisers. Listen, fundraising doesn't work anywhere. I mean, my kid's school, they've completely done away with fundraising just because it never generates. So if it doesn't work for third graders, don't expect it to work for a multifaceted ERG group. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't exceptions to that, but have a dedicated bucket of money for your ERGs to invest in partnerships with associations, hosting virtual webinars because everything's virtual these days. Have given them funds to do things for their internal community and get involved in those external things. And also, what I would say is, when I mention putting together a core team and you're building these things, right? Make sure you got the right people in those co-chair slots. It's known that there's not a full-time ERG job out there, right? In the industry, where you hire somebody to come in and run the veterans ERG and that's their day job and their night job. It's 9 times out of 10, it is somebody with a day job and that plate is a lot of times loaded. So have somebody that's committed, do a passion check, make sure that they're going to get in here and put together the AOPs and things like that. And that's the third thing that I would mention. Don't get complacent on your AOPs, right? Your annual operating plans. Be robust, be specific, have a mission each fiscal year that you want to do, not just an overall vision and mission, but have I guess it would be a goal. Have a goal at the end of the fiscal year. We want to impact the business by A, B, and C. We want to impact our community by A, B, and C, right? And build that AOP or that annual operating plan around that. Be specific and intentional in what you're going to do as an ERG. So those would be my 3. And I think they align well with what you were talking about.
And with your AOP piece, I'm going to say this: measure.
Oh,
measure.
Great point.
And of course, I always say to this as when you measure, recognize. You have to give recognition where it's due, because these are people who are doing it as additional. And I tend to say this for anywhere I walk into. ERG members aren't volunteers. They're people who are taking on extended assignments.
Yeah.
That's it. They're doing more.
You and I saw the value in measuring things that don't typically get measured. If you think back when we were working and we came up with a way to evaluate organizations and associations and things like that. And we just saw the overall value of how measuring specific efforts that people don't think about in an unconventional way of reporting. I mean, how do you know what's working and how do you not know what's working? So,
and you let it do this, and I'm gonna tack on for clarity. People always ask, how do you measure them, right?
Yeah.
That's a big question everyone always asks.
Yeah.
Tie it back to the purpose, right? If your purpose is talent, how do you measure talent? Well, talent acquisition has a way of measuring it. Employee engagement has a way of measuring it.
Hires and
retention. Exactly. Yeah. If you're talking about how are you going to measure community impact, well, do you measure donations? Do you measure volunteer hours? Do you do every area has a way of measuring. That's why I say it, tie it to something that your business understands and needs. Trust me, there's a measurement there. Use that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's good that you circle back to that, because I would imagine some listeners like, okay, that's great, guys, but how do we do this? And for me, it's don't boil the ocean with this. And that's why it's important to line out how you want your ERG to impact your business throughout that year. And are you setting a 12-month goal, a 24-month goal? What are you setting? Be realistic. We talk about the SMART acronym and all that. And sometimes I get tired of hearing it. I hear it so much, but it holds value, right? And it's a good thing. So I would say that. So James, we're kind of coming up on our time here. We've had some great conversation. Here's what I'm going to put a little pressure on you here. We have talked about a lot of stuff, a lot of best practices, a lot of challenges and opportunities. If you were in front of all the major CEOs, in business, what are some of the 5 best practices ERGs can, or companies can implement when thinking about their ERGs? Just give us 5.
Number
5 focus
one,
areas.
yeah, focus area, absolutely. Number one, tie it back to the business to the business. Number one. Number 2, invest and commit to that investment. 2, making sure, and I say this wholeheartedly, that you select the right people with the people. Number 4, when it comes to ERGs, you have to make sure that they don't forget who they are, right? Don't have them get lost in the minutia. Make sure they're on point. That means don't take off that business hat and put on just an ERG hat. It needs to be one and the same. Don't let them lose sight. And then last but not least, give them a seat at the table to truly contribute to you. Because if you don't give them that seat at the table, it's going to spin, and that's all it's going to do.
I couldn't have said it better myself. James, thank you so much for coming into the cafe and sharing all this great insight pertaining to ERGs. I knew you were the perfect person to talk about this.
It's a pleasure is all mine, Joe. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care.